There is an ancient root that has been used for thousands of years across Asia, India, and the Mediterranean. And in the last 2 decades, researchers have begun to understand exactly why it works on something that affects tens of millions of Americans over 60. The burning, the numbness, the feeling that your feet are wrapped in wet concrete every morning when you get out of bed. If you've been quietly living with that, I want you to stay with me, because what I'm about to share is not what your doctor told you. And it's not what the pharmaceutical industry wants you to know. I've been working with patients over 60 for a very long time, and I can tell you, without hesitation, that peripheral neuropathy is one of the most mismanaged conditions in modern medicine. People come to me after years of suffering, years of being told this is normal for your age, years of taking medications that leave them foggy, unsteady, barely functional, and still waking up at 3 in the morning with their feet on fire. What I'm going to share today is the real story behind why this happens, what is actually driving that nerve damage deeper and deeper, and what the research now clearly shows about a specific ancient root that supports something your nervous system desperately needs. But here's what makes this even more serious, and I'll get to that in just a moment. Most people treating neuropathy are actually making it worse without knowing it. First, let me tell you about that ancient root, because if you've heard of turmeric, if you've tried it for joint pain or inflammation, you already know part of the story. But what researchers have discovered about turmeric's active compound, curcumin, specifically in nerve tissue, goes far beyond what most people understand. The ancient healers who used this root weren't wrong. They were observing something real, and now the science is beginning to explain the mechanism behind what generations of traditional medicine already knew. Curcumin has been studied extensively for its effects on neuroinflammation, the specific type of chronic low-grade inflammatory process that silently eats away at your peripheral nerves over years and decades. But here's the critical piece that most people miss. Standard turmeric capsules from the grocery store have almost zero bioavailability in nerve tissue. The curcumin doesn't reach the nerves. That distinction matters enormously, and I'll come back to it, because this is where the real story begins. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you walked from one room to another without thinking about whether you might trip? When was the last time you got into a hot bath and actually felt the water temperature with your feet? When was the last night you slept from midnight to 6 without being woken up by that burning sensation that travels from your toes up through your calves? That feeling like someone pressed a hot iron against the soles of your feet and left it there? If you're over 60 and you have any degree of neuropathy, these aren't abstract questions. These are Tuesday night. These are every morning when you put your feet on the floor and stand up slowly, one hand on the nightstand, because you've learned that the floor beneath you doesn't always feel the way it should. I've worked with patients who described watching their feet like they were watching someone else's feet. Disconnected, unfamiliar. One woman told me she used to love gardening. She spent every weekend in her garden for 30 years. She stopped because she couldn't feel the ground properly anymore. She was afraid she'd step wrong, twist an ankle, fall, and not be able to get up. That's not a minor inconvenience. That is the slow theft of someone's identity. Another patient, a retired teacher, told me he stopped going to his grandson's baseball games because walking from the parking lot to the bleachers had become an ordeal he wasn't willing to perform in public. He didn't want people to see how he walked. He didn't want to ask for help. He just stopped going. That's what this condition does when it's left unaddressed. It doesn't just affect your feet, it takes pieces of your life, one activity at a time. The tingling that starts in the toes and gradually moves upward, the stabbing sensations that come without warning, like an electric shock through the arch of your foot while you're just sitting reading, the hypersensitivity that makes the weight of a bedsheet feel unbearable, the nights when you can't find a position that gives you any relief and you lie there watching the ceiling, exhausted, in pain, wondering if this is just how the rest of your life is going to feel. These are the experiences of 20 million Americans, and the vast majority of them have been told either that nothing can be done or that the only option is a medication that sedates the nervous system into a kind of chemical fog while the actual damage continues underneath. Now, I want you to understand what is actually happening inside your body, because when you understand the mechanism, everything else starts to make sense. And here's where the research gets really surprising. Your peripheral nerves, the nerves that carry sensation from your feet to your brain and back, are not like wires in a wall. They are living tissue, dynamic, capable of responding to the right environment. But they are also extraordinarily sensitive to two things: oxidative damage, and inflammation. Think of it this way. Your nerve fibers are like high-definition cable lines running the length of your body. Each one is wrapped in a protective coating called myelin, like the rubber insulation around an electrical wire. When that insulation deteriorates, the signal leaks. It distorts. Sometimes it doesn't arrive at all. That's the numbness. Sometimes it arrives scrambled. That's the burning. That's the electric shock sensation. That's the feeling that your feet are simultaneously asleep and on fire. The signal is getting through, but it's wrong. Now, what deteriorates that insulation? This is what most doctors don't have time to explain, and what most pharmaceutical treatments completely ignore. The first and most significant factor is chronic neuroinflammation. This is not the same as the inflammation you feel when you sprain your ankle. This is a sustained, low-level inflammatory process, specifically targeting nerve tissue. It accumulates silently over decades. Poor diet, blood sugar irregularities, metabolic dysfunction, all of these feed the inflammatory process that is slowly dismantling the myelin layer protecting your nerves. The second factor is oxidative stress inside the nerve cells themselves. Your mitochondria, the energy-producing structures inside every nerve cell, generate free radicals as a byproduct of normal function. Over time, those free radicals accumulate faster than your body can neutralize them, and they damage nerve cell membranes, impair signal transmission, and accelerate the very deterioration that is causing your symptoms. The third factor is the one almost nobody talks about, and it may be the most urgent. If you are over 60, your body's ability to absorb certain key nutrients from food has declined dramatically. Specifically, methylcobalamin, the active neurological form of B12, is absorbed at a fraction of the rate it was when you were 40. And if you are taking metformin for blood sugar regulation, that rate drops even further. Metformin actively blocks B12 absorption. This is documented. This is not a fringe claim. Yet the majority of patients I've seen who take metformin have never been told this by the doctor who prescribed it. Methylcobalamin is not optional for nerve health. It is essential. Without adequate levels of the methylated form, not the synthetic cyanocobalamin found in most grocery store vitamins, but the methylated form, your body cannot produce or maintain the myelin sheath that protects those nerve fibers. The deterioration continues, the symptoms progress, and the patient is handed another prescription to mask what the original prescription helped create. Researchers at institutions studying peripheral nerve regeneration have published findings showing that the peripheral nervous system retains a meaningful capacity for recovery, far greater than most physicians appreciate, when the underlying nutritional and inflammatory deficits are properly addressed. What the data consistently shows is that nerve tissue, given the right biochemical environment, can begin to reorganize. Signal transmission can improve. The burning and tingling can diminish. This is not a theory. This is the direction the research has been pointing for over a decade. The problem is that this research exists in academic journals. It does not typically reach the patient in a 10-minute appointment. I had a patient, I'll call him George, 71 years old, retired electrician, diabetic for 12 years. He came to me after 3 years on gabapentin. 3 years of brain fog so severe he had stopped driving. 3 years of the burning in his feet being partially muted. But the numbness had continued to progress. He could no longer feel the pedals under his feet properly, which was part of why he'd stopped driving. His previous doctor had told him that neuropathy was irreversible, and that the goal was simply to manage symptoms. George had accepted that. He had resigned himself to it. When we began addressing the specific nutritional deficiencies driving his nerve deterioration, starting with high-dose methylcobalamin, adding alpha-lipoic acid for the oxidative burden inside his nerve cells, supporting his mitochondrial function with acetyl L-carnitine, George began noticing changes within the first couple of months, not dramatic, but real. The burning at night became less frequent. He started sleeping longer stretches. The feeling in his right foot, which had been almost completely numb, began to return partially. He told me it felt like the fog was lifting, not just from his feet. From everything. That is what happens when you stop masking symptoms and start addressing the biological environment those nerves are actually living in. This is where I have to tell you something uncomfortable, because I've watched this pattern play out hundreds of times, and the emotional cost of it is real. The person who comes in after years of suffering is not just physically exhausted. They are grieving. They have given up things they loved. They have reorganized their entire life around a condition that didn't have to progress the way it did. They feel shame about how they walk in public. They feel embarrassed asking for help on stairs. They feel guilty because they can no longer pick up their grandchildren or get down on the floor to play with them. And they would never say that out loud, but it is there. The grief over who they used to be, the anxiety about who they are becoming, the fear. And this is the one that keeps people awake even more than the burning. The fear that this is just the beginning, that it's going to keep progressing, that the numbness will keep climbing, that one day they will fall and not be able to get up, that they will become dependent, that they will lose the thing that at this point in their lives matters more than almost anything else, their independence. And this is why getting the right information, the right understanding of what is actually driving the deterioration, matters so much, not just physically, but psychologically. Because when you understand the mechanism, you stop feeling like a passive victim of aging. You start to see that there are specific addressable factors at work, and that changes everything. If what I'm sharing today is new to you, and I suspect it is, make sure you subscribe to this channel. I release critical health information for people over 60 every week. Information your doctor may not have time to share in a routine appointment. Hit the subscribe button below. It costs nothing, and it could be one of the most important health decisions you make today. So let's talk about what the research increasingly supports in terms of nutritional intervention for peripheral nerve health. The first compound, and I consider it foundational, is methylcobalamin, not cyanocobalamin, not hydroxocobalamin. The methylated form, specifically because it crosses directly into nerve tissue in ways that the synthetic alternatives cannot replicate. Clinical observations have consistently shown meaningful improvements in nerve conduction and symptom reduction when patients with documented B12 deficiency are supplemented with methylcobalamin at therapeutic doses. This is the form that participates directly in myelin synthesis. If you're taking a B12 supplement and it says cyanocobalamin on the label, understand that the majority of what you're taking is not reaching your nerve tissue in a usable form. The second compound is alpha-lipoic acid. This is a specific antioxidant that works inside the mitochondria of nerve cells, the place where the oxidative damage that drives neuropathy actually accumulates. Standard antioxidants like vitamin C and E cannot penetrate nerve cell mitochondria effectively. Alpha-lipoic acid can. Researchers studying it for peripheral nerve support have observed reductions in pain scores and improvements in sensory function. It is one of the most studied natural compounds specifically for nerve tissue, and its mechanism is well documented. The third is acetyl L-carnitine. This amino acid compound supports energy production inside the nerve cells themselves, giving damaged nerve fibers the metabolic fuel they need to maintain structure and function. Studies in clinical settings have consistently identified it as a meaningful support compound for peripheral nerve health, particularly in patients with diabetes-related neuropathy. Benfotiamine, the fat-soluble form of vitamin B1, deserves particular attention for anyone with elevated blood sugar or prediabetes. Unlike standard thiamine, benfotiamine penetrates nerve tissue with dramatically greater efficiency, and it has been studied for decades specifically for its role in protecting nerves against glucose-related damage. Magnesium rounds out this picture. It is involved in the regulation of nerve signal transmission at the cellular level, specifically in controlling calcium channels that, when dysregulated, cause the kind of nerve hyperexcitability that manifests as burning, cramping, and electric shock sensations. The majority of people over 60 are chronically deficient in magnesium, and that deficiency measurably worsens nerve pain. Now, finding each of these compounds separately, in the correct biochemical forms, at the right doses, properly combined, is genuinely difficult. Most people don't have the time or the background to navigate that. That's why I've left a link in the description to a formula that brings all of this together. I've reviewed it carefully, and it is one of the few options I feel comfortable recommending. The link in the description below takes you directly to the natural nerve support formula I recommend to my patients. It combines everything I've covered today in the specific forms that actually reach nerve tissue. Take a look when you have a moment. I think it will make a lot of sense after what you just learned. Now, I want to address something that comes up every time I have this conversation. Why hasn't your doctor told you any of this? And I want to be honest with you because the answer is not simple, and it is not a conspiracy. The medical system is structured around patentable interventions, drugs that can be approved, standardized, and prescribed in a 10-minute appointment. Nutritional biochemistry doesn't fit that model. There is no pharmaceutical company with a financial incentive to fund large-scale trials on methylcobalamin. The research exists in smaller studies. It exists in the clinical observations of practitioners who look beyond the prescription pad. Your doctor is not your enemy, but the system they practice within has enormous blind spots. And millions of people over 60 are sitting in those blind spots right now, being told there's nothing to be done, taking medications that mask their symptoms while the underlying damage continues. That is not acceptable, and you deserve to know it. Here's what I want you to take away from everything I've shared today. You are not powerless. Your body is not simply failing you on a predetermined schedule. The peripheral nervous system has a remarkable capacity to respond when the specific deficiencies driving its deterioration are actually addressed. The burning, the numbness, the sleepless nights, these are not your fate. They are signals. Signals that your nerve tissue is not getting what it needs. And now you know what it needs. And remember what I said at the beginning about that ancient root, about curcumin, about turmeric, about the traditional healers who used it for centuries without knowing why it worked. The research on its neuroinflammatory effects is real, but it is one piece of a much larger picture. A picture that includes the myelin-protecting power of methylcobalamin, the mitochondrial repair supported by alpha-lipoic acid, the cellular energy of acetyl L-carnitine, and the nerve signal regulation of magnesium and benfotiamine. When these work together, in the right forms, at the right levels, they address the biological environment your nerves have been living in. Not by masking the signal, but by changing the conditions that are distorting it. If today's video opened your eyes to something important, share it with someone you care about, because there are millions of people over 60 dealing with this silently, and they don't have to. The link in the description goes directly to the natural formula I recommend. Take a look when you have a quiet moment. Subscribe for more critical health information every week, and leave a comment below. What was the most surprising thing you learned today? I read every single one.